Hello, everybody. This is the third summary session for Philosophy 60. We have been through the introduction to Gramsci Althusser and a bit of a synopsis of the Meno and some of the stakes in its tripartite structure, beginning with the quest for a definition in the beginning, and secondly, the work on the definition of excellence as knowledge, and then finally, the structure of recollection as a pedagogical and learning practice, and the politics of such an action, and then thirdly, of course, and finally, alongside that, excellence is finally determined by Socrates and well as something divinely dispensed wisdom that is common to all and needs to be practiced. So wisdom again becomes this kind of code word in the ancients for both experience of practice, learning, knowledge, and the desire for justice all in one, and becomes a kind of comprehensive, overarching concept that we still work with today, saying that someone is wise rather than just knowledgeable, or someone is wise in measuring justice rather than just dispensing it. So we'll go back to that. I'm planning to do that in conjunction with our readings in Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics, which is on the table for this week. I'll give another a short summary of that later. But today, what I would like to do for this third session is to go over the Althusser, the philosophy for non-philosophers once again. I know there's been some questions, both in class and in emails to me concerning this reading. It's not the easiest reading of all. Althusser is attempting again to invent a materialistic conception of philosophy. And he's fighting a very long tradition of idealism and realism and nominalism, all in the history of philosophy. So this is a very ambitious venture by Althusser, a prospectus, if you will. And this is the course that he is doing again, and written notes from 1978 to 1980. So today, what I'd like to do is just sum up a little bit. Again, where he starts. He starts with the philosophy of the non-philosophers, very much like Gramsci's spontaneous philosophers. He has that kind of connection in mind, that everybody, again, is a philosopher, and to wipe away that strongly held position and prejudice that philosophy is just the purview or the practice of those who are professionally trained in the discipline and become professional or technical philosophers. We will talk more about that too, because we're going to read later on philosophy and practice in Althusser. So anyway, the first thing that he really speaks about in terms of philosophy is patience, and being in a world apart is part of being a philosopher. You know, one has to step out the everyday, the commonplace, in the Gramscian sense, outside of common sense, in order to understand this extraordinary level of experience and practice that happens in the philosophical endeavor, and becoming a philosopher, becoming an active philosopher. Again, in Althusser's case, the materialist philosopher. So he begins there with patience and the world apart. I'm referring again to page 19. And then he also speaks about the question of endless rereading. And this is something that I myself have practiced in my own, intellectual journeys, life of the mind, if you will, and life of the mind and in society, and hopefully transforming the world in that practice, both regarding my own self and the relations I have, social relations in the world. So again, the rereading is an astonishing moment. I hope that all of us in this class and is taken forward after this class, is that the rereading of philosophy is crucial. It's not what you just read or glance over or peruse. in the first glance. It's really the actual rereading that things begin to gel. Maybe the second time, the third time. There's an old saying that the text itself, the reading itself, hides from the first comer, meaning that those who think they get it right away are really fooling themselves. They're kind of embedded in this ignorance that Socrates is trying to critique, right? So this is very important to keep in mind as we go forward. So, I think that again, he's going to be defining materialism throughout the semester. We'll be going back to that. Pages 22 through 25 are engaged more in the difference between the materialist practice of philosophy versus that of the idealist. The idealist, again, thinks that they live in this world of forms, these worlds of abstractions only that do not become concrete entities. Only in this world of forms are projected. They can be imaginary in a certain way. Maybe we could call the Platonic idealism a kind of ideology of forms, and and work with that concept as we move forward this semester. So the materialist philosophy, as he says, is um, about calls on people to look outside themselves, to the exterior, to look at the social relations, or in Gramsci's sense, this socialization of ideas, once again, that both condition us and place us in kind of positions of perspective. And this is something always to keep in mind and hopefully engage in changing, critiquing, and transforming. This would be very, very important for us to engage in and think through. So I hope this is something that is on our agenda, and we continually engage this kind of putting ourselves and the knowledge we have into question throughout in this social struggle we have. Okay, so again, the materialist claim that everyone is a philosopher. The materialist can understand how to listen. That's what the materialist does well, listens carefully, tries to listen both between the lines and on the margins of the lines. So that operation is always at work to the materialist philosopher in a way. And let's people talk, that kind of open space where someone speaks and listens and tells the way the things that are. And at the same time, that there is this recognition that is underlying all of this, that things could be different, to pick that apart, what's being heard, to a level of where it becomes a critical movement and an active movement forward. Althusser ends the chapter on the beginning, on letting the non-philosopher speak and its relationship to materialist philosophy with religion as a passive resignation. In the second lecture that he gives, Philosophy and Religion, he takes this up and he begins with the materialist philosophers on page 29 once again, in the question of beginnings versus that of origins. God does not create the world. It is better to go back to beginnings. And in the beginning, there was always already something, always already matter. This is very, very important to remember in this rereading. You're always already situated in a material space, the materiality of matter, how that moves through not only space and time, and also produces certain types of causalities, as well as the givens of the matter. And of course, in relationship to this, there's something about the social significance. So he will go through this all the time, and then there's a long excursus on what is religion, and we'll talk more about that. As we go on in the semester, we're reading two of the great critics of religion, perhaps even three of them. Certainly Freud in the book The Future of an Illusion, which was religion, a conversation he has with the priest Oscar Fitzer, and that'll be towards the end of the semester in December. And of course, Marx, when he says religion is the haven for the homeless in a heartless world, the sigh of the oppressed. Religion is the opiate of the people. And this is very important to remember as well, the opiate of the people. What could that mean? in many ways. So we'll talk about that as well. We'll also speak about the practice of philosophy, a la the materialist philosopher alongside Socrates, who basically is saying to us, both in the Meno in some ways, and we're going to see later in the Apology, that philosophy is the art of learning how to die, which also means living well. So this is a very, very important aspect that the materialist philosopher also begins with. So we'll talk about that. And then page 39 through 44, to the end of the course on philosophy and religion, or through page 44, is engaged with differing viewpoints and the origin of philosophy, the veritable revolution in knowledge, which is equaled by geometry. And we see this at work, this page 39 and 40, and mathematics at work, in the dialogue, the Meno, in the slave boy experiment. Please, again, I encourage you to try to relate this to the readings in a whole way. Again, we're going to be talking in a minute about abstraction. Part of abstraction is taking that part, abstracting it, taking it out, appropriating it, and then trying to move back, if you will, towards the concrete. And we'll talk about this circle and this cycle that Althusser speaks of in terms of processes of abstraction. So part of this course's intention and ambition is to help you make connections through parts and whole relationships, and be able to read and reread and make these connections between the texts we're engaging, both in difference and distinction, and at the same time in similarity and an analogous fashion. Okay, so we're going to move on to the big detour, which is the second, movement of his lectures here, this course in the late 1970s, and the big detour. How do we begin? The big detour starts here. One has to leave one's world behind and make the big detour of the world to go on this long journey for something different. And he speaks about this. We'll call on the philosophers both farthest and nearest to us. So Althusser, in his way, and I think this is very important, can both read Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus from the ancients, as well as others, all the way through Machiavelli, who we're reading this semester, as well as the contemporary people that he is engaged with in polemics and argumentation, and make them somehow connect, right, in many ways, right? So you make both a distance from the philosophy of the philosophers, and at the same time trying to dive in deeper, right, in order to come home to what philosophy may be. So he begins this with the section on abstraction, and that's the first thing. Going back to the dominant advent of the world's first science and the philosophy that took shape, right? And he goes on that, to really speak about what is this concrete, right? That the characteristic feature, if you will, of the first science was to break with the empirical practice of the mathematics of an earlier day. And this is, again, connected back to the previous chapter on philosophy and religion, in which he speaks to the moment of Thales, this veritable revolution in geometry, right? And the reason as the basis of demonstrations about abstract objects. The geometry is dealing with, figures, shapes, relationships between these figures, etc. And the question of abstraction, is begins there. So the question he is posing here once again is, you must look at the worlds behind you, right? In a way, this break with the empirical practice that our sense experience tells us. You guys are always using the language, it makes sense to me. That is an empirical experience, right? In a sense, the making sense. It is not at the level of the theoretical that really is trying to look at levels of abstraction, right? That got us there from the concrete, say the isosceles triangle, the Pythagorean theorem, these kind of things. We must demonstrate this, on the basis of demonstration of the abstract objects. And of course, you see this in terms of the search for definition in the Meno. What is a shape? What is a color? And how he goes about this, Plato and Socrates especially, goes about this in dialogue with the Meno, right? So what is abstraction? Abstraction, we abstract, we take from, we detach from a part of reality in order to focus on the remainder or on the rest. So to detach a part from the whole. Abstract literally means to pull, abstract, pull apart, right, etc. So he gives, Althusser gives this very important analogy to the first abstraction that we really have is language. And he goes through many, many levels of this. This is beginning on page 51 when he says, what after all, right? And he goes on, but what if we said the first abstraction that people have to do with in their everyday acts, day and night, yes and night in their dreams was language? And then he asks the question, what after all is a word? If not a sound, a sound, an articulated sound, and thus something that exists in nature that has been extracted, hence abstracted, from the whole set of sounds existing in nature. What is language? Yet this abstract, which also means abstracted thing, known as a word, possesses the existence of abstraction only because as a sound, it is combined with the thing that it designates. So we have word and thing, word and what it designates. So when you call a cat, we mean that the sound cat produced by a certain configuration of the muscles of the mouth and the tongue is associated with a natural reality. The animal that goes chasing after mice meows when it's hungry, and thus called, and then the one that's called cat. Cat is then a sound because a word that has been associated with the living thing that is a cat. It is also plain, though, as with the chimera, the composite meaning of two elements extracted from nature, the sound cat and the animal cat, is really arbitrary. It just comes out of nowhere. We don't have a logical reason for this. And Plato talked about the arbitrary nature of the choice of words used to designate things, although he thought there was a natural correspondence. Whereas in Althusser, and he cites the linguist Saussure, Saussure, who wrote a famous course in general linguistics, which was taken up by many philosophers post World War II as a model of how to investigate language, right, etc. So, and it really spoke to the arbitrariness of language. So on pages 52, 53, etc., Althusser will talk about, this level of abstraction, this abstraction going on in terms of language. That's what we have. And language ultimately, there's no natural necessity between words and things, but the words and things that are designated. So language becomes, again, a double system. It's both phonological, the different sounds, and then the grammatical, which is then the arrangement of words into sentences. So sentences then are regulated by laws. So you have this in terms of grammar and the grammatical, right? And you also have the phonological. And bringing these two together, right? It is language that makes this operation called, and abstraction is an operation, once again, possible. And he gives also the example from the German philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who was born in 1770, whose real days in the sun were 1807 until his death in 1831. But anyway, there's an example of the here and now, that we're always changing. When we see something this here and now, I am changing moment to moment. There's a changing abstraction. So what Althusser is really trying to do is saying, listen, there's no natural connection in our language between things designated and where we are. What's really happening is that there's a social communication. Hence, we have ideology here as well, right? So the act of appropriation is, he gives the example of law, right? And, that abstraction, in a way, is leading to the concrete, right? Abstraction is leading to the concrete. What is missing in anything in terms of active appropriation of when we say a cat is a cat, it's that social communication that is being implied and explicit together in terms of saying, this is a cat, this is my cat here and now. All of this presupposes this element of social communication. So it is the social that is very important here for both Althusser and, as you know from Gramsci, when we spoke about socialization of ideas in the realm of common sense and trying to understand that better. Okay, so he wants to move here to show the concrete. We see a horse, right, in a way, as concrete, but how did we get to saying that horse? How did this abstract set of relations come to identify this horse? This is really very important. How do we get to that at the limit? And he begins to speak about a dialectical circle on page 55, and I will diagram this for you maybe this week, so that we're on the same page here. But this is happening on page 56. The dialectic, there's no abstraction ever without the existence of the concrete. So first there is the concrete that's presupposed, right? The concrete object in the world. The question is, what part of that made us go full circle back around to the concrete, that process that is operating, and what levels are there in many ways? So this is very, very important to keep in mind. We are dealing with levels of abstraction. I will talk about this in terms of Plato's forms. Of course, in terms of how Aristotle says we should start from principles, begin with principles, rather than from the forms or the ascent towards the forms. There are some differences at work here. So I read from page 57 in Althusser. We have the order of a cycle. The concrete is there at the beginning. Then comes the abstract, then the concrete again. That is what is explained above. Social appropriation of the concrete proceeds by way of the domination of abstract relations. What relations are making this? There are two concretes. The concrete that is not appropriated socially, which we are presupposing, which at the limit is nothing at all. And the concrete that is not just socially appropriated by individuals, but produced in concrete by appropriation. So these are the levels of abstraction that allow us to get to this concretization. I will speak more about this again with the commodity form in Marx at the beginning of Das Kapital, which is very important for our purposes as we go about. So without language, excuse me, and without law, without relations of production and ideological relations, nothing in the world is concrete for us. You can neither name nor attribute it or nor produce it and make any intentions known. So without language, number one, and without the regulation of law and the limits it presupposes, we cannot, basically talk about the concrete. So he ends that chapter there. We're going to proceed after an understanding of this abstraction to go on to the question of philosophical abstraction and its specific nature. And this is going to begin on pages 67 through 71, when mathematical language and how calculus and mathematical language is born. And this is going on between two philosophers, one of which we're again going to read later in the semester, Rene Descartes and Gottfried Leibniz. So I look forward to further discussion about this. Again, what I'd like you to glean here, again, is the importance of language in all of this, and language as social communication, and the arbitrary nature of language in terms of its beginning, in terms of the concrete, arbitrary in a way, presupposes social communication. We're not looking for the origins of language. Again, we're looking for the beginnings in social communication and how to abstract from that level. So this will tie up, at least for today, the Althusser, the three lectures, one on philosophy, what the non-philosophers say, the spontaneous philosophers, the non-professional philosophers. Where do we go? How do we get out of this commonplace? How do we get out of this kind of world of perception that we become habituated to into a world outside of this, right? To a different world. Secondly of all, what becomes the relationship between materialism and idealism as philosophical movements? And again, the avowed ambition of Althusser to produce the beginnings of an investigation into what a materialist philosophy would look like, and something very much based on Marx and a notion of history and society very different than had been thought up until that point. We'll speak about this later too. And then, of course, this relationship of passive resignation in the face of realities and the need for religion, and then ultimately what is religion, and then of course this process, and again a process called abstraction. So this will be very important for us to continue to look at as we go on. So I suggest once again that you read very carefully these pages, right, on abstraction, and we again will go over this week in the big detour, the section called the big detour, and this begins on page 47 and then through 58, and then again we will be reading philosophical abstraction this week and talking about this in structures in the Meno and how that unfolds. My next lecture here, and I'll leave it here for today on abstraction, will be on the summary of Aristotle going back in time, where we also were very distant from the philosophers of the past, but still very near in many ways. We're going to be speaking about Aristotle's notion of what ethics is, the difference between intellectual excellence and that of moral excellence, character, building of character, and also the doctrine of the mean, and also the notion he has of the psyche. The psyche is a Greek word. The psyche we use today is the Greek word for the soul, and we will speak about those parts and how the soul must live up and be in harmony with one's desire, and how this action may lead to happiness. So we'll be asking some other questions too that we have forgotten to ask. What is happiness? What is the good? And we'll be relating this back to Plato. Okay, so thank you, and we'll stop here for today. Thank you. Okay.